Scary telling.
I always thought the idea that murderers could somehow recognize each other was just a myth, something you read in Pulp Fiction or see in B-movies. But then, one day, I realized that it was true. I realized that I had it too, the murderer's sixth sense. It started while I was serving as a judge in a high-profile case. The defendant, a young man accused of murder, had been in court for weeks. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to agree that he was guilty. But as I watched the trial unfold, I began to feel a sense of unease. There was something off about the defendant, something that didn't quite fit with the image of a cold-blooded killer. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then, one day, it hit me. He was innocent. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I just did. It was like a voice in my head, a gut feeling that refused to be ignored. And so, when the time came to deliver my verdict, I did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. "He's innocent," I announced with the bang of my gavel, dismissing the court. The reaction was immediate and intense. The prosecution was furious, the media was in a frenzy, and the victim's family was in tears. But I knew that I had made the right decision. I had listened to my instincts, and they had led me to the truth. After that, things started to change for me. I started to see things differently, to notice things that I had never noticed before. I would see people on the street and just know that they had killed someone, that they had taken another person's life. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, like a curse that I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows. And then, one day, I met someone who was different. Someone who didn't have that same darkness in their eyes, that same sense of guilt and shame. We started talking, and as we spoke, I realized that I had found something that I had been missing for a long time, a kindred spirit. Someone who knew what it was like to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, to bear the burden of a secret that could never be spoken. We became friends, and for a while, everything was good. But then, one day, something changed. I started to see that darkness in his eyes, that same sense of guilt and shame that I had seen in so many others. I tried to ignore it, to pretend that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, one night, I saw it, the proof that I had been looking for. He was standing over a body, a knife in his hand, his eyes wild with fear and rage. I should have called the police, should have turned him in and let the law take its course. But instead, I did something else. I walked away, leaving him alone with his guilt and his shame. It was the easy way out, the coward's way, but I couldn't help myself. I knew what it was like to live with that burden, to carry that weight, and I couldn't bring myself to add to it. And so, I continued to live my life, haunted by the knowledge of what I had done, haunted by the murderer's sixth sense that had led me to this point. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know one thing: the darkness is always there, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to consume me at any moment. I've tried to forget about it, tried to bury the memories deep down inside, but they always come back to me in the dead of night. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. Sometimes, I wonder if I made the right choice, if I should have done something differently. But deep down, I know that it was never really a choice at all. I was always going to walk away, always going to turn a blind eye, because that's who I am. A murderer, just like the rest of them. And so, I live my life in the shadows, haunted by the ghosts of my past, waiting for the day when my sins will finally catch up with me. I don't know what form they'll take, whether it will be the police or the vengeful family of one of my victims, but I know that it's only a matter of time. Until then, I'll keep living my life, pretending that everything is normal, hiding my true self from the world. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm a murderer, and there's nothing I can do to change that. As I sit here, writing these words, I can feel that darkness creeping in, the weight of my guilt and shame pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. But I'll keep going, keep writing, because maybe, just maybe, it will help me to find some sort of peace. Or maybe not. Maybe I'll just keep living in this perpetual state of fear and anxiety, waiting for the day when the hammer finally falls. All I know is that the murderer's sixth sense is real, and it's a curse that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It was just another night for me and my son, Charlie. We had finished our bedtime routine, and I was tucking him into bed. As I was about to leave the room, he said, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." I couldn't help but smile at his request, so I crouched down and peered under the bed. To my surprise, I saw another Charlie under the bed, staring back at me with wide, fearful eyes. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this was not my son. It was his doppelganger. I stood up quickly and tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard a whisper. "Daddy, there's somebody on my bed." I turned back around and saw that the doppelganger had crawled out from under the bed and was now sitting on top of it, staring at me with the same wide, fearful eyes as before. I tried to muster up the courage to approach him, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The doppelganger then spoke again, its voice trembling. "Please, Daddy, don't leave me alone with him. He's been tormenting me all night." I didn't know what to make of this. Who was this him that the doppelganger was talking about? Was there really someone else in the room with us? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement from the doppelganger. It jumped off the bed and started running towards me. I stumbled backwards and fell to the ground, my heart racing with fear. The doppelganger loomed over me, its face contorted into a grotesque expression of anger and hatred. It spoke again, this time with a voice that was not my son's. "You should have never come here. Now you're trapped, just like me." With that, the doppelganger vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the room with my son's empty bed. I tried to tell myself that it was all a dream, that none of it had actually happened. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. From that night on, strange things started happening in our house. Doors would open and close on their own, objects would move without explanation, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of the doppelganger out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't until months later that I finally discovered the truth. Our house was built on top of an old burial ground, and the doppelganger was the vengeful spirit of a young boy who had been buried there long ago. I knew then that we had to leave the house, but it was too late. The doppelganger had become too powerful, too malevolent. It had taken on a life of its own, and there was no escaping its grasp. To this day, I still hear its whisper in my ear, feel its breath on the back of my neck. I am haunted by the doppelganger, and I know that I always will be. I've always had a fascination with masks. From the time I was a child, I was drawn to them, their mysterious allure captivating me. I loved the anonymity that they provided, the freedom to be someone else for a while. So when the pandemic hit and everyone started wearing face masks in public, I was thrilled. At first, it was just like wearing any other mask. I would try out different designs and colors, experimenting with different looks. But then I started to notice something strange happening. Every time I wore a mask, I felt like I was a different person. It was as if the mask had taken on a life of its own and was controlling me. I became addicted to the feeling of wearing a mask, of hiding my true identity from the world. It wasn't long before I started wearing a mask all the time, even while I was alone at home. I just loved the feeling of skin on skin, the way the mask hugged my face, becoming a part of me. But then things started to get really weird. People would stare at me when I was out in public, as if they could sense something was off. And every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a different face staring back at me. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes a woman. Sometimes it was someone I knew, and other times it was a complete stranger. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But then I started to hear voices, whispers in my ear, telling me to do things. Horrible things. Things that I knew were wrong, but I couldn't help myself. One day, I woke up with a terrible headache, my mind foggy and my body aching. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a face that I didn't recognize staring back at me. It was grotesque, twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. That's when I knew that something was seriously wrong. I tore off the mask, but it was too late. The damage had been done. I had become something other than myself, something twisted and evil. Now, I'm locked up in a mental institution, the doctors trying to figure out what went wrong. But I know the truth. It was the masks. They took over my mind and turned me into a monster. So if you see me on the street, wearing a mask and smiling at you, don't be fooled. Behind that mask is something that you don't want to see. Something that you should run from as fast as you can. Something that craves the feeling of skin on skin. Our old farmhouse had always been alive with the sounds of children. For years, my family and I had heard their little voices and footsteps running up and down the hallways, playing in the old bedrooms, and laughing in the living room. At first, we were scared, but over time, we got used to them. They had become a part of our daily life. But one day, something changed. The house grew silent. The voices and footsteps that we had become so accustomed to were gone. My family and I felt a sense of unease settle over us, as if something terrible was about to happen. At first, we tried to ignore it. We told ourselves that maybe the ghost children had just moved on, that they had found peace and were no longer bound to our house. But as the days went by, the silence grew deafening. We started to notice other strange things happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, and we would hear strange whispers in the dead of night. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, and we could feel cold spots in various parts of the house. My parents even reported seeing the ghosts of the children standing at the foot of their bed, watching them as they slept. We knew then that something was wrong. We had lived with the ghost children for so long that we had grown complacent, thinking that we had nothing to fear. But now, we were scared. We knew that we had to leave, but we didn't know how. One day, I decided to go into the attic to see if I could find any clues as to what was happening. As I searched through old boxes and forgotten relics, I stumbled upon an old diary. It belonged to a woman who had lived in the farmhouse many years ago. As I started reading, I realized that she had also experienced the presence of the ghost children. But as I read on, my heart sank. The diary revealed that the children had died in a tragic accident, trapped inside the house during a terrible storm. They had never left, and their spirits had been trapped in the house ever since. And then I read something that made my blood run cold, The diary entry ended with the woman saying that she was afraid that the children were angry, that they wanted revenge. I raced down the stairs to tell my family what I had found. We knew then that we had to leave, that the ghost children were no longer harmless. As we packed up our belongings, we could hear their voices and footsteps growing louder and more frantic. We knew that we had to hurry. We made it outside just as the storm started to pick up. The wind howled and the rain pounded against the roof. But as we looked back at the house, we could see the windows glowing with an eerie light. And then we heard the children's voices calling out to us, begging us to stay, promising us that they would never hurt us. But we knew better. We knew that the ghost children were not our friends, that they were angry and vengeful. We drove away, never looking back. Years later, I returned to the farmhouse, hoping to find some closure. But as I approached the house, I could feel the same sense of unease settling over me. I walked through the empty rooms, feeling the weight of the ghost children's presence around me. And then, as I turned to leave, I heard their voices once again. But this time, they were not begging me to stay. This time, they were laughing, taunting me, promising me that I would never be free of them. And I knew then that the ghost children would never let me go, that they would always haunt me, no matter where I went or what I did. I ran out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and never looked back. To this day, I still hear their voices and footsteps in my dreams, and I can feel their cold presence whenever I'm alone in the dark. I know that I'll never be truly free of them, that they'll always be with me, haunting me, until the end of my days. So if you ever find yourself in an old farmhouse, and you hear the voices and footsteps of ghost children, don't make the same mistake that we did. Leave while you still can, because once the silence descends, it may already be too late. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of knocking. My first thought was that someone was at the front door, but the knocking sounded different, somehow. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from my bedroom mirror. At first, I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things. I was tired, after all, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the knocking continued, getting louder and more insistent with every passing moment. I got out of bed and walked over to the mirror, trying to see if there was anything on the other side. At first, all I could see was my own reflection, staring back at me with wide eyes and a look of fear. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the glass, pounding on the surface with its fists. It was impossible, but there it was. A person, trapped inside my mirror. I stumbled back in terror, tripping over my own feet and falling onto the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran to turn on the lights, hoping that it would somehow banish the figure from the mirror. But when the lights came on, the figure was still there, still pounding on the glass. It was a woman, with long, tangled hair and a look of desperation in her eyes. I could see her mouth moving, but I couldn't hear anything she was saying. I reached out to touch the mirror, and my hand met with resistance. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between me and the woman in the mirror, keeping us apart. I tried to speak, to ask her what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. For what felt like hours, I sat there in front of the mirror, watching the woman on the other side. She never stopped knocking, never stopped trying to get my attention. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I sat there, staring at the mirror in shock, wondering what I should do next. And then, without warning, the woman in the mirror spoke. Her voice was faint, but I could hear her clearly. "Please," she said. "You have to help me. I'm trapped here, and I don't know how to get out. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some trick of the mind. This was something real, something terrifying. And I had no idea how to deal with it. Over the next few days, the knocking continued, and the woman in the mirror grew more and more desperate. I tried everything I could think of to free her, but nothing worked. And then, one day, she just disappeared. The knocking stopped, and when I looked into the mirror, all I could see was my own reflection, staring back at me with an expression of confusion and fear. I never did find out what had happened to the woman in the mirror. But even now, years later, I can still hear her knocking sometimes, in the dead of night. And I know that I'll never be able to shake the feeling that she's still out there, somewhere, trapped in the reflections of my own fear.